My name is Alara, and for most of my life, I have been an echo in my own home. A quiet presence my family learned to speak over, a figure in the background of photographs they never bothered to frame. They saw my frugality not as a choice, but as a limitation. When I took the bus, my sister, Maeve, would laugh. When I ordered water at a restaurant, my father, Richard, would sigh with a kind of theatrical pity. They mistook my silence for emptiness, my gentleness for weakness. Last night, however, something shifted in the quiet air of our family home. Over a dinner meant to celebrate Maeve's latest promotion, the soft, familiar cadence of their condescension faltered. It happened the moment the candlelight caught the antique diamond on my finger. My mother, Eleanor, who was mid-sentence, simply stopped, her mouth a perfect O of disbelief. My father's jovial expression hardened into a mask of confusion. And Maeve, her laughter died on her lips, replaced by a stark, questioning silence. "Oh, this," I had said, my voice barely a whisper, turning the ring so the facets caught the light. It was just a small gift. To myself. What they never understood is that the quiet spaces they left around me were not empty. They were fertile ground. And in that silence, I had been tending to roots they never knew existed, roots that ran deeper than their foundations of polished stone and hollow praise. This is the story of how I learned to cultivate my own garden, in a world that tried to convince me I was nothing but a weed. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and rose as I turned onto Sycamore Lane. It was the street I grew up on, in a town called Willow Creek, a place that held the scent of rain-soaked earth and the ghosts of my childhood. I hadn't been back for the holidays in 3 years, not since Grandma Annalise had passed, but the familiar curve of the road still knew how to find the hollow ache in my chest. Cars with luxury emblems lined the curb, polished and gleaming under the streetlights that were just beginning to hum to life. I had to park my modest sedan 2 blocks away, near a storm drain choked with autumn leaves. It felt fitting somehow. As I walked toward the house, I wasn't nervous, but deliberate. I moved with a careful economy of motion, a habit learned from years of trying to take up less space. The house stood just as I remembered it, a 2-story colonial with pristine white siding and dark green shutters. The brass knocker on the front door shone, and the porch swing, where Grandma Annalise used to sit and knit, was draped in a tasteful, impersonal garland. The doormat read, "The Kellers, a legacy of success." I paused, my eyes tracing the sharp, confident letters, then stepped over it, my worn leather boots making no sound on the stone. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and my mother's expensive perfume. Laughter and the clinking of wine glasses spilled from the dining room. No one came to greet me. I slipped off my simple wool coat, feeling a sudden, oppressive warmth. I rounded the corner into the dining room, a space that always felt more like a showroom than a place for family. The long mahogany table was set with gleaming silverware and crystal goblets. Every seat was filled, except for one at the far end, tucked away near the drafty bay window as if it were an afterthought. My chair. Maeve looked up first, her gaze a slow, deliberate appraisal that started at my practical shoes and ended on my simple, unstyled hair. "Alara, you made it. We weren't sure you'd find a bus that ran this late." Her voice was smooth as silk, but the words were laced with the familiar, subtle poison. My father grunted a vague acknowledgement without looking up from carving the roast. My mother turned, her lips pressed into a thin, tolerant line, the kind of expression one gives to an uninspired piece of art. I walked to the empty chair. No one moved to help me. I pulled it out myself, the scrape of its legs on the polished hardwood floor sounding unnaturally loud in a brief lull in conversation. I sat and unfolded the linen napkin onto my lap. A few of my cousins glanced my way, their smiles tight and fleeting, before turning back to their conversations. Maeve raised her glass. "A toast," she announced, her eyes finding mine. "To family. And to those who grace us with their presence, however rarely." A few polite chuckles rippled around the table. My mother's gaze landed on my coat, which I had draped over the back of a nearby armchair. "Is that the same coat from last winter, dear?" she asked. "It's warm," I said softly. Her mouth twitched. "I'm sure it is." I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I focused on the food, spooning a small portion of mashed potatoes onto my plate. I hadn't come for a fight. I had come for a memory. The conversation swirled around me, a current I was not invited to join. Maeve detailed a recent victory at her law firm, a high-profile case that had landed her a feature in a local business journal. Richard boasted about his new membership at an exclusive golf club. Eleanor recounted the success of her latest charity gala, proudly stating they had raised nearly $50,000 for the new Symphony Hall wing. I ate in my quiet bubble, the food tasteless in my mouth. I was an audience to their lives, a silent observer they kept around for reasons I think even they had forgotten. Then, the inevitable turn came. "So, Alara," my mother said, her tone dripping with forced brightness. "How are things? Still working at that little nonprofit?" Before I could form a reply, Maeve leaned forward, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Or did they finally downsize your department? I hear donations are down everywhere." The table grew quiet. All eyes were on me. This was the part of the performance where I was supposed to shrink, to offer a self-deprecating excuse, to affirm their superiority. I set my fork down with a quiet click. I reached for my glass of water, and as I did, the sleeve of my simple sweater slid back, just enough to reveal the ring. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was undeniable. An antique, rose-cut diamond in a delicate platinum setting, its fire subtle but deep. It spoke of old money, of quiet elegance, of a world they aspired to but had never truly entered. Eleanor's breath hitched. Richard, who had been reaching for the wine, froze, his hand hovering in midair. Maeve's perfectly glossed lips parted. Is that real?" Eleanor finally managed to ask, her voice a strained whisper. I glanced down at my hand as if noticing the ring for the first time. I turned it slowly, letting the candlelight dance across its facets. "Oh, this," I said, my voice calm and even. "Just something I picked up on a quiet afternoon." The silence that followed was profound. It was heavier than any argument, louder than any boast. The air crackled with unspoken questions. I looked at each of them in turn, my mother, my father, my sister, and saw the same bewildered disbelief bloom in their eyes. The question was there, hanging between us, sharp and urgent. How? But I wasn't going to answer. Not in the way they expected. I wasn't there to brag about a jewel. I took a slow sip of water, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable for them. "But I'm not here to talk about jewelry," I said, my voice soft, but carrying a new weight. I let my gaze travel past them, to the corner of the dining room, near the fireplace. It was where Grandma Annalise's armchair used to be. The chair she'd sat in every evening, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic beat, a sound that was the true pulse of this house. Now, the space was occupied by a large, sterile-looking ficus tree in a ceramic pot. "I'm here for her." A new kind of quiet fell over the room, one laced with confusion and a dawning unease. I stood up, my own chair scraping back gently. "I'm not here to talk about jewelry," I repeated, my voice steady. "I'm here for her." My gaze remained fixed on the empty space where her chair should have been. That worn, floral print armchair, the arms softened and frayed from years of her leaning on them, the slight indentation in the cushion that was hers alone. I remembered perching on the arm as a child, listening to her stories. I remembered sitting on the floor at her feet as a teenager, her hand gently stroking my hair as I cried over some small heartbreak. Did no one save her a place? I asked, my voice low and honest, not an accusation but a simple, painful question. A fork clattered against a plate. It was my mother who answered, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece of hydrangeas. "Annalise is gone, Alara. It's been 3 years." "I know," I replied, nodding slowly. "But this house, this family, it was built on her kindness. On the foundation she laid." To not even leave her a symbolic seat at the table, I let my words hang in the air. "It feels like you've forgotten who held up the roof." A few seconds of thick, uncomfortable silence passed. No one knew what to say. I turned back to my plate, the perfectly roasted food now looking grotesque and foreign. My appetite was gone. It was never about the food, not really. It was about the communion, the connection. It was about her. I blinked and, for a moment, the polished dining room dissolved. I was back in the small, sun-drenched kitchen, the scent of lavender and yeast in the air. Grandma Annalise was hunched over the table, her hands, gnarled with arthritis, struggling to shell peas. I was 16, home from a miserable shift at the local diner. I'd sat down beside her without a word and taken the bowl, my young, nimble fingers making quick work of the task. She had watched me, her gaze soft and full of a sad wisdom. "You have quiet hands, Alara," she'd whispered. "But they're strong. They know how to care for things." She had reached out and covered my hand with her own. "They will remember that about you one day, long after they've forgotten the noise and the flash." I hadn't understood her then. But now, looking at the empty space where her chair used to be, at the family that had so easily replaced her presence with a decorative plant, a painful clarity began to dawn. A sharp sound pulled me back to the present. Maeve was standing, pouring herself more wine, her movements deliberately nonchalant. As she passed behind me, she smirked. "Still so sentimental. Grandma would have wanted us to move on, not build a shrine." I saw her glance toward the main hallway, where a gallery of family photos had always hung. I followed her gaze, a cold premonition creeping into my heart. Something was wrong. Excusing myself quietly, I walked into the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. The wall, once a sprawling tapestry of our family's history, had been completely rearranged. The centerpiece, a large, silver-framed photograph of a young Grandma Annalise laughing in her rose garden, was gone. In its place hung a glossy, oversized print of Maeve accepting an award, her smile professionally bright and utterly soulless. My father's golfing trophies now lined the console table where Annalise's hand-stitched needlepoints had once rested. Every single photo that had featured her alone, every piece of her art, every trace of her individual existence had been systematically erased and replaced by symbols of their own achievements. I reached out, my fingertips brushing against the cold glass of Maeve's award photo. My voice, when it came, was a low murmur, not meant for the whole room, but a truth spoken into the violated space. She planted the roses in that garden with her own 2 hands. Maeve had followed me into the hall. She didn't miss a beat. And we had the garden professionally landscaped last spring. "It looks much better now." I turned to face her, my grief solidifying into something harder, something clearer. "No," I said, my voice gaining a quiet strength. "You just paved over the roots." That struck a nerve. A flicker of something guilt? Annoyance crossed her features before she smoothed it away. She turned and walked back to the dining room without another word. Dinner concluded in a strained, humming silence. I helped clear the plates out of habit. No one offered a word of thanks. That, at least, hadn't changed. Later, as I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes, my mother cornered me. She leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, arms crossed, adopting the same posture she used for delivering quiet lectures when I was a child. "You came back for the inheritance, didn't you?" she said, her voice stripped of its earlier pretense. "This whole performance about Grandma, it's because you think you're owed something." I dried my hands on a dish towel, taking a moment to compose myself before I turned to face her. "No," I said. "I came back because Grandma was right about you." Her brow furrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" I took a small step closer, into her personal space, a boundary I had never dared to cross before. "She left me more than just memories, Mother. And by the look on your face, I think you've known that for a very long time." For the first time all evening, Eleanor looked genuinely rattled. Her hand instinctively gripped the countertop behind her, her knuckles turning white. "You don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, her eyes darting away from mine. "Oh, but I did. And she knew I did." I didn't say another word. I walked out of the kitchen and back to the armchair where I had left my coat. I reached into the deep inner pocket and pulled out a soft bundle of fabric. It was Grandma Annalise's favorite shawl, a pale cornflower blue, hand-knitted from soft merino wool. She called it her comfort cloak for chilly evenings. I walked back into the silent dining room and gently, reverently, draped the shawl over the back of the empty chair at the end of the table. No one spoke. Not Richard, who stared into his empty wine glass. Not Maeve, who was frozen, her phone forgotten in her hand. And not my mother, who stood half hidden in the doorway to the kitchen, watching me with a look of dawning horror. I had done what I came to do. I didn't need to stay and watch the fallout. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Each step was an echo of a year I had spent in silence. But tonight, for the first time, they were finally listening. It's a strange irony that the ones a family calls ungrateful are often the ones who remember the most. After the profound silence of the dining room, I took the stairs one at a time, my hand trailing along the polished banister. I paused at the top of the landing, at the door to what was once my bedroom. It was slightly ajar. I hadn't set foot in that room since the week after Grandma's funeral, when I had packed a single suitcase, thinking I'd be gone a month at most. Time, however, has a way of turning temporary escapes into permanent exiles. The small, hand-painted wooden sign that had read Alara's haven was gone. In its place, a piece of masking tape was stuck to the door, with the word storage written in thick black marker. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale and cool. It was a physical blow seeing it. The room hadn't just been emptied of me, it had been actively scrubbed of my existence. My single bed was gone, replaced by stacks of my father's old golf magazines and boxes of unused holiday decorations. My beloved bookshelf, which Grandma Annalise had built for me, had been dismantled, its wood likely repurposed or discarded. The walls, once a soft robin's egg blue I had chosen myself, were now painted a flat, impersonal beige, a color my mother called optimal for resale. In the corner, propped against a stack of boxes, was the old full-length mirror from my closet. My reflection looked pale and foreign, a stranger who had stumbled into the storeroom of someone else's life. I used to stand in front of that mirror and dream of becoming a writer, a botanist, an artist. Now, all that remained of those dreams was the faint, ghostly outline on the carpet where my desk used to be. I sat on a dusty packing crate, the cardboard groaning under my weight. The silence was thick, but it was a familiar companion. Then a voice cut through it. Well, well. The prodigal daughter returns to her palace. Maeve leaned against the doorframe, swirling a glass of red wine. She had that same look of amusement she always wore when she felt she had the upper hand. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Alara. I didn't turn to face her. I didn't want drama, Maeve. I just wanted to be seen. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. You think you are some kind of misunderstood saint? Reading to Grandma, bringing her tea, as if you were her only grandchild. I looked at her then, my gaze steady. I was the only one who sat with her when the house was empty. I was the only one who held her hand when she was afraid of the dark. I did what I hoped someone would do for me. Maeve rolled her eyes with practiced ease. She was leaving the house to all of us, you know, in equal shares. Until you got in her ear and turned her against us with your sob stories. I rose from the crate slowly, not with anger, but with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from her version of the truth. I didn't turn her against you, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You erased her long before she was gone. She just finally noticed. She froze. A crack appeared in the flawless porcelain of her confidence. What did she leave you? She asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a long, ornate skeleton key. It was old, made of brass that had been polished to a warm glow, but its edges were worn with age. I held it up so it caught the dim light from the hallway. I didn't come back for money, Maeve, I said, meeting her gaze. I came back to honor a promise. Her eyes narrowed, fixated on the key. Is that to her safe deposit box? Still, I said nothing. I walked to a dusty chest of drawers and placed the key on its surface, a tangible piece of a truth I was no longer willing to hide. Maeve stood motionless, but I saw her hand tighten around the stem of her wineglass until her knuckles were white. The questions were churning behind her eyes, but for once, she had no cutting remark to offer. I walked past her, out of the room that no longer remembered me, and back into the hallway. My mother was there, waiting. She stood stiffly by the linen closet, her arms crossed tight against her chest, a sentinel guarding a fortress of denial. You can't do this, Alara, she said, her voice a low, taut wire. I stopped. Can't do what, mother? This. dredging up the past, trying to rewrite history. I studied her face, the familiar lines around her mouth seeming deeper tonight. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as my own, were cold. Not with malice, but with a profound and terrifying emptiness. "I'm not rewriting anything," I said softly. "I'm just reading the pages you all tried to tear out." She flinched. It was barely perceptible, but I saw it. A recoil, as if the truth had grazed a nerve she thought was long dead. "She was old," Eleanor whispered, a desperate plea. She was confused at the end. She wasn't thinking clearly. I tilted my head. Confused enough to leave me this key? And the letters? And the location of her journals? I let the last part hang in the air between us. Letters. Journals. Things they never knew existed. For the first time, my mother had no response. Her wall of carefully constructed denial had begun to crumble. I walked past her, past the family portrait that still hung in the hall, a portrait taken on a day I was present, but positioned behind the camera, at their request. I went downstairs, through the silent kitchen, and out the back door. The cold night air was a relief, sharp and clean against my skin. I crossed the damp lawn to the old oak tree in the far corner of the yard. The tire swing Grandma Annalise had hung for me was still there, its rope frayed but holding. I sat on it, the worn rubber cool beneath me, and let it drift gently. "Higher, Alara," she used to call, her voice full of laughter. "Reach for the moon." I looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened a saved audio file, a voicemail she had left me a few weeks before she passed. I hadn't been able to listen to it in over a year, but tonight I needed to hear her voice. "Alara, my love," her voice came, thin and reedy, but warm as ever. "You always said you found stories in the stars. Don't ever let them convince you that your light isn't bright enough to be seen. It is. I see it. I see it now, too, Grandma," I whispered into the quiet darkness. A gentle peace settled over me, not of victory, but of alignment. I was finally standing in my own truth. The cold morning mist was still clinging to the manicured lawns of Oakhaven when I arrived the next day. The law office of Sterling and Finch was in a restored brick building on the town square, with a dark green door and polished brass lettering. It felt solid, dependable, like the man Grandma Annalise had entrusted with her final wishes. I stepped into a quiet waiting room that smelled of old books and lemon oil. A kind-faced woman who introduced herself as Aunt Clara, Annalise's younger sister, greeted me with a warm, sad smile. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, where my mother had kept her at a distance. "I'm so glad you came, Alara," she said, her hand resting on my arm. She made me promise I wouldn't interfere. But she also made me promise to be here for you when the time came. She led me back to a large, sunlit office lined with leather-bound books. Mr. Sterling, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a reassuring presence, stood to greet me. "Miss Shaw," he said, shaking my hand. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. And a very shrewd one." He gestured for me to sit, and once we were settled, he slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished desk. My name was written on it in Annalise's elegant, looping script. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. Inside was her official last will and testament, stamped and notarized, along with a handwritten letter and a small, faded photograph. The photo was of the three of us, Grandma Annalise, Aunt Clara, and a 10-year-old me, sitting on a porch swing, all of us laughing, our faces tilted toward the sun. We looked like a family. A real one. I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, then I have gone on to my next great adventure, and I wasn't able to say a proper goodbye. But you, my sweet girl, were my goodbye. You were the one who stayed. You sat with me through the long, quiet afternoons. You brought me soup when I was too weak to cook. They came for my possessions, but you, Alara, you tended to my heart. I have rewritten my will. Everything is yours now, the house, the savings, the small parcel of land in Oregon I bought years ago. I know this will cause a storm. I know they will not understand. But you're stronger than any storm they can create. You were always the one who knew the value of things that can't be bought or sold. You were the gardener in a family of architects. Don't ever forget the importance of what you cultivate. Keep this photo. It's how I will always remember us. Happy. All my love, now and forever. Grandma Annalise. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of validation, of being truly seen. The weight I had carried for years, the feeling of being less than, of being invisible, began to lift. Your mother has already filed a petition to contest the previous will, Mr. Sterling said gently. She claims your grandmother was not of sound mind. She can try, I said, my voice thick but steady as I carefully folded the letter. But Grandma left me the seeds. It's time I started planting. Aunt Clara squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of sorrow and pride. As I stepped out of the law office and into the bright morning sun, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Maeve. Mom is frantic. She said you stole something from the house. You need to bring it back. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. I hadn't stolen anything. I was just finally reclaiming what was mine. I started my car and drove back toward Willow Creek, not as a visitor, but as the rightful heir to a legacy of quiet strength. It was time to go home. By the time I turned onto Sycamore Lane, the sky had shifted from the crisp blue of morning to the softer hues of late afternoon. I parked directly in the driveway, a small act of defiance that felt monumental. As I walked to the front door, I saw a flicker of movement in the living room window, my mother, pacing. I didn't knock. I used the old-fashioned skeleton key Grandma had left me. It slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, but the tension was a physical presence. My mother, father, and sister were all gathered in the living room, their faces a mixture of anger and anxiety. What is the meaning of this? My father, Richard, demanded, his voice booming in the quiet house. I walked past them to the dining room table and laid the thick envelope from Mr. Sterling's office upon its polished surface. This, I said simply, is Grandma Annalise's final will and testament. The real one. Maeve, ever the lawyer, snatched it up and began to read, her eyes flying across the legal jargon. My mother's face went white. This is absurd, she stammered. She was senile. We can have this thrown out. It's notarized, witnessed, and has been on file with her attorney for over a year, I said calmly. The house, her savings, the land in Oregon. It's all mine. We took care of her. Richard bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. We paid her bills. You just showed up to play the doting granddaughter whenever you felt like it. I met his furious gaze without flinching. You housed her body, but you starved her spirit. She told me about the nights you'd all go out and leave her with a cold plate for dinner. She told me about the way you spoke about her as a burden when you thought she couldn't hear. My voice was low, but every word was a stone dropped into the silent room. You think a piece of paper changes anything? Maeve scoffed, though her voice trembled slightly. I was hoping you'd say that, I replied. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. An audio file began to play, a recording from my last visit, captured when I'd accidentally left my phone's voice recorder on. First, my mother's voice, sharp and impatient. Once she's gone, we can sell this place and downsize. The upkeep is a nightmare. Then Maeve's. That Oregon property alone has to be worth a small fortune. We could finally clear our debts. And finally, my father's. Just make sure Alara doesn't find out about any of it. She'd get all sentimental and want to turn the house into a museum or something. The silence that followed their recorded words was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the room. It wasn't just shock on their faces, it was the raw, ugly horror of exposure. You didn't just erase her, I said quietly, putting my phone away. You were waiting to profit from her absence. No one moved. No one spoke. The grand clock in the hallway chimed the hour, its melodic tones a bizarre counterpoint to the family's utter ruin. I picked up the will and tucked it back into its envelope. I'm not kicking you out tonight, I said, my voice devoid of malice, filled only with a calm finality. I want you to spend one more night in this house. I want you to feel what it's like to be an unwelcome guest in a place you thought you owned. I walked to the front door, my hand on the cool brass knob. The locks will be changed at 9 a.m. tomorrow, I added softly. You have until then to remove your personal belongings. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, not with a slam, but with a quiet, decisive click. The evening air felt clean and cool, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could finally breathe it in. The legacy wasn't just the house or the money. It was the strength to finally stand up and claim my own space in the world. The next morning, 2 weeks later, I stood in a bright, airy community gallery in downtown Willow Creek. The space, a former library, smelled of fresh paint and old paper. Sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, illuminating the displays I had spent the last 10 days carefully arranging. This was not a memorial of grief, but a celebration of a life. On simple white pedestals and framed on the walls were the things my family had deemed worthless. Grandma Annalise's intricate quilts, with their hidden patterns of hummingbirds and stars. A collection of her handwritten recipes for everything from sourdough bread to rose petal jam. Her delicate watercolor paintings of the Oregon coastline. A framed display of the pressed flowers from her garden. Beside each item, a small card told a piece of her story. The exhibit was titled, Annalise Keller, The Things We Keep. Aunt Clara stood beside me, her hand clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. She would have been so proud, Elara, she whispered, her eyes misty. She's in every stitch, every brushstroke, I replied, my heart full. By noon, a steady stream of people began to flow through the gallery. They weren't art critics or wealthy patrons, they were the people of Willow Creek. An older woman paused by a quilt. Annalise made one of these for my firstborn, she said to no one in particular. We still have it. A young man, a paramedic, stood for a long time in front of a watercolor of a lighthouse. She used to volunteer at the hospital, he murmured. She'd read to the patients in the long-term care wing. She had the kindest voice. Story after story began to surface, weaving a tapestry of a woman far richer and more impactful than my family had ever acknowledged. Her legacy wasn't in a bank account, it was etched into the heart of her community. Then, just as the gentle hum of conversation reached its peak, the gallery doors swung open. My mother, father, and sister stood there, dressed in funereal shades of black and gray, their faces thunderous. What is the meaning of this circus? Eleanor hissed, marching toward me, her heels clicking angrily on the polished concrete floor. Airing our family's private life for the entire town to see? Before I could respond, Hugo, the gallery owner, stepped forward. Ma'am, this is a private event. Unless you have an invitation. This is what you do with her money? Richard snarled at me over Hugo's shoulder. Wasted on this sentimental nonsense? This isn't about money, I said, my voice calm. This is about memory. Her memory. The one you tried to erase. Just then, a woman with a reporter's notebook and a press pass stepped up to my mother. Eleanor Keller? I'm from the Willow Creek Chronicle, she said politely. We received an anonymous tip regarding a fraudulent will filed in the county court last year, contesting the estate of Annalise Keller. Would you care to comment on the allegations of forgery and elder financial abuse? The color drained from my mother's face. Richard stammered, grabbing her arm to pull her away. Maeve, for the first time in her life, looked utterly defeated. The truth, once spoken, had a life of its own. They turned and fled, not with anger, but with the quiet, desperate shame of the exposed. As the last of the visitors drifted away that evening, leaving behind a guest book filled with loving memories of Annalise, I stood at the small podium at the front of the room. I hadn't planned to speak, but it felt necessary. My grandmother, Annalise, wasn't a loud person, I began, my voice clear and steady. She didn't build monuments or seek accolades. She built community. She cultivated kindness. My family saw her as a burden to be managed. But they were wrong. She wasn't the burden, she was the bedrock. I looked out at the small, kind faces before me. She didn't leave me an inheritance of money. She left me an inheritance of courage. The courage to see value where others see none. The courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. And the courage to plant a garden in a place others have left barren. There was no applause, only a deep, respectful silence, followed by a quiet, collective sigh, as if the whole town was breathing out a story it had held for too long. The next morning, I drove back to the house on Sycamore Lane. I walked through the quiet rooms, which now felt cleansed, peaceful. In the backyard, the garden was overgrown with weeds, but I knew the soil beneath was still rich. I knelt down, my hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. I pulled a small paper packet from my pocket, heirloom tomato seeds, saved from Annalise's last harvest. I pressed them into the soil, one by one. I didn't know if I would stay in this house. Maybe I would sell it and use the money to start a foundation in Annalise's name. Maybe I would move to the little plot of land in Oregon and learn to paint the sea. The future was an open book, its pages waiting to be written. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the yard, I stood by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands. The diamond on my finger caught the fading light, sending a quiet sparkle across the room. I smiled. It wasn't a trophy of victory over my family. It was a reminder. A reminder that my grandmother had seen the gem in me all along, even when I was buried under layers of doubt. Justice hadn't been a storm. It had been a quiet, steady unearthing. And sometimes, the most valuable thing you can possess is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth.